Good morning. We're going to be starting up in about 2 minutes. So you know. A little over 1 more minute. We'll be starting up. Okay, it's 9 o'clock, but we're going to give folks just a couple of minutes because we know that it's a big crowd this morning, and then we'll get started. So we'll start up in about 30 seconds or so. Okay, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar, 1 hour why webinar this morning on roads and streets legal issues. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the New York LTAP, the Cornell Local Roads Program. And as we've been doing these webinars, we can't get into a lot of detail in 1 hour, but we can hopefully give you some foundation to help you out. Now, just to keep some things in mind to help you out here, if you haven't been on one of our webinars before, the controls are at the bottom of the screen, your audio settings on the lower left. The chat pod, it may or may not be disabled, but we do advise you to open it up. That's really the place where we're going to put messages for you. In fact, right now, hands-free, you're going to get a link to a handout, which you may want to download and look at. It goes through the outline of today's webinar and has some really good links that you may want to look at later on. And then the other hands-free item that's going to pop there magically in is, you should already be able to see it, is a link to the Poll Everywhere website where we're going to be doing some polls. I may ask you to raise your hand in a couple of places during the day, and Q&A. Really want to take advantage of that. If you have any questions and maybe even an answer or two to some of the questions I asked when we're not using polls, we'll do that via the Q&A. So please make sure you use those tools. This webinar is worth 1 professional development hour here in New York State. Okay. We don't not necessarily going to enable the chat, by the way, if you're asking. We'll do things via the Q&A. So if you have a question, just throw it in there, Michael. We'll take care of it. But it's 1 PDH. Only the person registered gets credit, but it is a course here in New York State because it's a legal related topic. If you're from out of New York State and you needed it, well, you're going to need to check with your LTAP center to see whether or not it meets the requirements in your particular state. Now, today we are talking about legal issues. Okay, so there's a caveat here. I am first and foremost, as you saw, it's PE behind my name. I'm an engineer. So this is my perspective with over 30 years of watching all of these legal issues that we deal with from my time over in Yates County to the time I've been here at Cornell University. So just a caveat, it's I'm not a lawyer, and I don't plan to be one. But hopefully this is useful for you. If you have questions, you really want to check with your legal counsel, with your municipality, and things like that. Now, in terms of helping everybody else, we're going to do a little bit of a welcome. We're going to use the Poll Everywhere tool to get us started, to figure out not only who's here, but help you realize there's actually quite a bit of support that's available. Okay, so it's going to be www.pollev.com/DavidOrrPE. Okay, now in the handout, we list 3 of our workshop manuals, which we think you should download if it's related to legal issues. There are plenty of those workshop manuals available. Powers and duties, identifying and reducing legal liability are our 2 primary legal ones, but you also may want to download Running Your Highway Department, which has a summary of some of the things, and it's a little bit of a good outline for today's webinar. So those are 3 I would definitely download, but there's also links to legal resources that you may want to look at over time. Okay, so let's see who's on the class today. Okay, oh, it is making me log in. Okay, let's just do this. I don't know why it did not do that when I tested it this morning, but this is definitely worth doing. It doesn't like the password. Well, what we're going to do, gotta click on that, and then you can see my password there, right? That's all those dots. And gotta send the old push. We use dual systems here. Why? Well, there's actually some legal issues involved with that too. So, okay, so here we go. Sorry for the delay there. Who do you work for? Do you work for a town, a county, a city or a village, state or federal, tribal, private industry, a consulting firm, or do you work for the weekend? Okay, and 3% of you are honest and you're working for the weekend, though it's the start of a brand new year. So, okay, that's cool. That's quite a variety of folks. That's good to see. And I've been looking at the names too of you logging in, so that's helpful as well. Okay, that helps me a bit when we get to some issues where we deal with differences between towns, counties, cities, and villages, and even some state and federal issues. And of course, there's always the private side as well. Now, the other thing that helps me quite a bit is, what is your job? What do you do? Are you an administrator? Are you the highway official, DPW commissioner? Are you an engineer by trade? Are you in the field crew supervisor? Are you actually a board member? And then if you're none of the above, throw it in the Q&A what none of the above means, just because I'm curious. And if you can't access Poll Everywhere, you can put it in the Q&A and I can just sort of mentally add that into the numbers. It's okay. So however you can get me the answer, that's great. And so I've got a D in there. It looks like somebody who's saying that they are in the field crew. Okay. And I see we have somebody from the state who's a local projects liaison at the region. That's good. Okay. Transportation planner, things like that. Okay. So a lot of you are engineers, probably want those PDHs to get the year started, but quite a few highway officials. It's quite a variety, actually. That's good. Like to see that. Okay. Now, this is a new one. We added this in, partly because we're starting a new year and partly because we know some people may actually put in A. How long have you been in your current position? You know, how long have you been the highway official or on the field crew? Okay, so quite a bit of you are 20 plus, and now we got a few folks, so less than a month, probably started on the 1st. Congratulations. You know, that's useful for us to know. If you've got colleagues who've just started, who are brand new town highway superintendents or somebody working for a village, let them know about these webinars, get them involved. There's a lot of good information, and of course, talking with colleagues and things like that. And then finally, where are you from? Okay, this is pretty cool, and I like these. We're going to use a couple of these. Click on the map just to see the spread of where folks are from. And if you're from outside the state, you can click on outside the state. So, okay, let's see. We got Vermont, we got Ontario, and we got all over New York State. Okay. Oh, we got somebody a couple of people who are swimming in the lake. Okay. So backstroke, water's not that cold yet up in Lake Ontario, so you'll probably be okay. Okay, cool. That's a nice spread. That's good to see as well. Okay, and we got these lake people. Now, these webinars are part of a series we're doing. I'm calling them why webinars, because we're not going to get into the nuts and bolts too much, though we will talk a little bit about a few. We have to. But the idea is to cover the foundations, to give you the why we do these things. Today we're doing legal issues for roads and streets. Next week is departmental duties, so you'll see we're going to talk a little bit about that even today. We're going to switch gears and talk about worker safety and culverts and finding, retaining, and motivating employees after we take a 1-week break. We're taking a break because the county highway officials, highway superintendents, have their meeting up in Saratoga Springs, and we don't want to conflict with that. So we're taking that week off while they have their meeting. Okay. So now, as you saw in the handouts, I'll just bring that up. If you haven't downloaded it, you may want to download it. That handout has in it a bunch of links. It is a bit of an outline of what we're going to be talking about today, and a list of all of the webinars that are available, because we've recorded even the ones we held last fall, and they're available to you. So it's something you may want to take into account. Okay, so let's start with the law. Okay, now if you've ever read Oliver Twist, or you've seen the musical Oliver, there's a character named Mr. Bumble. He runs the workhouse, and at one point he gets in trouble because his wife did something and he didn't know about it, and he was told that the law says this, and he replied that if the law supposes that, then the law is you can figure it out by reading the book or listening, go watching Oliver again. The law is an interesting thing, and as I was putting this together, I was actually thinking about the last webinar we did before the holiday break on traffic control devices. And it was a slide I put together when I was thinking I might be doing it, that I thought, this is actually a good way to get started. When we talk about legal issues, let's talk about that foundation where we start. Now, traffic control devices are signs, stripes, and signals, and these are some humorous pictures that we've either collected or had sent to us over the years. And yes, all 3 of these are actual pictures. But traffic control devices come from the law. It's still supported within the law itself, okay? So it's something we need to be aware of. So when it comes to the law, there's a foundation that we start with. That foundation is the Constitution. Now, I'm borrowing this graphic from one that I got from the Federal Highway Administration. They flipped it and put the top of the pyramid with the law and Constitution, but I put it as the foundation. I see these things as the bottom of the pyramid, the support. The law comes from that. So anything that we do within the law needs to meet our constitutions, whether they're federal or state. Whenever a law is passed, it's usually relatively short. There'll be a regulation that comes with that. And those regulations are pretty important. You got to follow everything. Now, your local agency may want to set a policy within those regulations. And that's what you're going to be doing as a group leader. You're going to be doing that as a DPW commissioner. You're going to set policy, but you got to make sure it matches the regulations, the law, and any constitutional issues that come in. You may develop some guides. You may get guides from others that have been developed. Those guides are written to match everything that's below them. And then, of course, all this comes back to an agreement or a contract that you might have with your board, with a contractor. It all follows, it's all supported on top of each other. And then, of course, on top of all of this, and in terms of volume, it's everything combined, is all the paperwork that goes with it, all the documents, all the supporting information. But looking at our sign issue, when it comes to signs, obviously we have our Constitution, both the state and federal, we the people kind of thing. There are laws written, and those laws can't conflict with the Constitution. That's where the courts get involved. Laws have been passed in New York State since obviously the 1700s when we were founded as a state, and every state's got old laws out there. But when it comes to traffic signs, there's a regulation. There's a national manual of uniform traffic control devices, which surprisingly is not a regulation in of itself. This is a good example. It was written as a guide or a policy, but once it's adopted by a particular state, as it has been done here in New York, now it becomes a regulation that needs to be followed. It drops down towards the bottom of that particular pyramid. And of course, here in New York, we not only follow the national manual of uniform traffic control devices, but we have a supplement. Little things we've included here in New York State that need to be done slightly different than they are at the federal level or the national level. For instance, our sign spacing is slightly different than the national MUTCD, okay? Now, your department may want to set a policy. Whether you follow exactly in this, we'll talk about how and when, but you could set a policy, for instance, that you never put up children at play signs, even though it's in the New York State supplement. These are local activities that you can set up. You may be able to find guides. We have a guide for traffic signs called the Traffic Sign Handbook. That's not a regulation, it's not a law. If you go to court, you actually have to have the MUTCD, but those guides should follow, and ours does, all of the policies, regulations, and law that were developed in this case for signs. And then eventually you may have an agreement or contract to put up signs, maybe an agreement with your board. It's a big pyramid, and we'll come back to that pyramid during the course of our hour together, okay? Now, I'm going to flip gears. I want to just talk a little bit about responsibilities. This will carry over probably into next week a little bit, but what are the responsibilities of a highway and public works department? One word, and we'll create a wordle. So if you put in more than one word, it's going to show up like that. So you might put in roads, safety, perfect example, okay? Consistency, maintain, what are you maintaining, okay? You're maintaining everything, yeah. Roads, okay, maintenance, enforcement, okay? Transportation, okay? But there's responsibilities that we all have. All of these responsibilities, where we're doing more generic terms like we have today, okay? Or we're doing more specific like signs and guide rail and culverts and bridges, there's actually a legal basis every one of these activities, okay? There's actually a legal background, and you need to remember that as we're thinking about doing things. There's always a legal way to look at things, okay? Now, for those who work for a town highway department, I cannot recommend enough to make sure you have a copy of something colloquially known as the Red Book. It's the Office of the Town Highway Superintendent. It's available from the Association of Towns. If your town is a member, you can get an online version, which is searchable, which is nice to have both the paper and the online version. If you work for a county, make sure you've got a copy. Because if it used to be a town road, that book can really help you out. Some really good information in there. If you're a city or village, there is an equivalent document. It's not exactly the same. It's listed in your handout. Get those documents. You don't have to know everything. You can find good resources and look these things up. And it's really useful to know these particular activities. And we'll come to some examples of why this is true later on. The other thing you want to make sure you've got access to is the law itself. And that's available online, and you can see that in the handout. But please do me a favor. You can use that law online to get you started, but you've got to understand that over time, there are opinions, court cases, things that caveats that change things. We really need to do something called case law. And here in New York State, we use something called McKinney's Consolidated Laws of New York. Most states have consolidated laws. And what this does is it lists the law, and then below it, it lists all the cases and opinions that have come out that might tweak the law a little bit. Because when you look at the law, it can be a little hard to interpret. How exactly do you interpret a particular phrasing from a legislature, especially if it's an old law that's 40, 50, 200 years old? Courts over time have made changes for this, or there's opinion from the comptroller or the attorney general's office, and they'll tweak things slightly, and that can make a big difference. So be careful of that, okay? And so it's really important to understand that if you have a question, don't just assume. Go talk to your legal folks, go talk to your town or county or city, village attorney, and get their opinion, help out, because you got to work together on this, because the written stuff isn't exactly the same. We're going to go through an example here in just a minute to look at that one, okay? Now, an example, by the way, of something that is an opinion that comes out, just to give you a perfect example, I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if your agency has a policy if a snowplow takes out the mailbox. Do you have a policy? Raise your hands. How many of you have a policy? Remember, policies are above regulations. Okay, so about 20 so far. Most of you probably have an unwritten policy. If you don't, you probably should think about having one. Okay, so yeah, so the answer is yeah, you're going to have a policy. Well, there's actually an opinion from the comptroller's office, and those opinions do matter, that says you may not be legally allowed to replace those mailboxes, even if you have them, because it might be considered a gift. Now, what do agencies do about that? What we say is, well, talk to your attorney, but make sure you have a consistent policy so it doesn't become a gift, that you treat everybody the same, and then you're probably going to be on better ground. If you don't have a policy, you could actually get in trouble in that particular case. And that's where these opinions in court cases can come into play. Now, we're going to talk about the most common question we get at something called the highway school. If you're new, you definitely want to come here in June to the highway school, and 700 of your fellow highway officials. We talk about everything, but one of the biggest events is the legal panel. And the question we get the most has to deal with right-of-way. So let's start with everybody who can get there. Let me get my computer to wake up. There we go. I want you to take the little mouse on Pull Everywhere and click the edge of the right-of-way. Okay, click the edge of the right-of-way. Oh boy, we got dots all over the place. There's somebody in the road. Okay, I think the right-of-way is probably a little wider than the one in the roadway. But you can see there's a huge variety of what people think the right-of-way is. Okay, is the right-of-way the edge of the pavement? Is it the fence? Is it the front of that tree? Here's the challenge. We really want to make sure we know where the right-of-way is. That's really important. We can do things in the right-of-way. We can actually do things off the right-of-way too. We'll talk about that. But knowing where that right-of-way is a big deal. Okay. By the way, in this particular case, the answer is the deed for this particular case. But the point is, knowing that is really important. And in terms of right-of-way, there really are three different ways you can have a right-of-way here in New York. Okay. You can have a deed, a piece of paper. Okay. And I see somebody putting a question about tax maps. We'll come back to tax maps in just a couple of minutes. Deeds are the best way to have right-of-way. It's a piece of paper filed at the county clerk's office that specifically states what is the edge of the right-of-way. You could have it just be a permanent easement on the deed, or it could be owned by the actual agency. You could actually own the roadway. Okay, so a deed is probably the best because it's the best definition. Everybody's clear. If you're not sure about that, if you have to go off the right-of-way that's owned, you may need to get an easement. Okay, and Dave McEwen, I see he's on here. He had a nice quote. He says, "We shouldn't have public facilities on private property." And I put in a caveat, without an easement. You need something so that everybody is on the same page on what is the right-of-way. Because we have this thing called right-of-way by use or streets by prescription. Okay, that affects probably 80 to 90% of the town highway system and a similar percentage of village streets. There's a set of laws, two laws, one in the town highway law portion and one in village law that define roads by use. We'll come back to that. Now the deed is nice. Sometimes you'll hear the term in fee. The deed is nice. Again, go down to the county clerk's office. Okay. Easements, there's two types, permanent and temporary. A temporary easement is when you're working and you need to take a tree down or you need to store equipment overnight. You'll do a temporary easement because you're not coming back. That still should be in writing. And it doesn't have to be complicated. This is a copy of one we have in one of our workshop manuals on drainage, but a simple easement so everybody's on the same page of what are you doing, when are you doing it, and when you're done, what's it going to look like. If you're going to be coming back, like it's a culvert that's going to extend out off the right-of-way, or you're going to be dealing with a bridge abutments, you'll need a permanent easement, okay? In that case, you're definitely going to want to talk to your legal folks, and there's a process involved with that. In fact, if you're getting federal dollars, there's something called the Uniform Act, which is pretty important to follow, okay? So those are the pieces of paper. The other one is this thing called by use. And again, I'm not going to read the paragraph to you, but it's one paragraph that essentially says that the highway superintendent shall lay the roadway out 3 rods in width. Okay, 3 rods in width. Now, 3 rods, for those who want to know, 3 rods, let me get my pen working here, is 49.5 feet. Okay, 3 rods. an old law, okay? So the problem with that is the way the thing is written, the courts have said, you can't just take people's land. You have to have acquired it through use. That's because that's what it actually says, roads by use or streets by prescription, which is another way of saying use. And essentially what it says with the court cases is if you've used it and it's been maintained for 10 or more years, 10 years, it's now in the right of way. So if you've been maintaining the ditch, you probably got to the backside of that ditch, okay? There also has to be a public use of that particular roadway, okay? So it can't just be a driveway to one house. It actually has to have a public use, okay? 10 years to gain. Here's the thing is, if you don't maintain it, you don't document it, you can lose it in 6 years. So by use can get very confusing. And one paragraph in the village law, one paragraph in town highway law, 27 pages combined currently in case law, last time I counted, of just the summary of the cases. So there's a lot of issues. If you're not sure, don't assume you're going to get yourself in trouble, okay? And there's two assumptions people make that get them in the most trouble. Number one is they want to use tax maps. Tax maps are not deeds. Tax maps are guides to help you figure out where the deeds are. They're really useful from that standpoint, but they're not a legal document for defining the right of way. And that 3-rod rule that's written into both laws, that's in the law, but the case law specifically says, no, you got to have a little bit more than that. You've got to have evidence that you've used it and maintained it, which is why we recommend anytime you're doing work, document, 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 okay? And if you start doing jobs where you're getting federal aid, you're going to need more than just by use. You're going to have an agreement, something in writing to guarantee that everybody's on the same page, okay? So don't use tax maps. Don't use the 3-rod rule. You have some rights there, but you'll have to go through the process if you really want to go out that way. And truth be told, by use can be wider than 3 rods. You get a culvert that's been out there and you've got evidence and you've logged that you've maintained it, you may get to the end of that culvert, okay? Again, that foundation that we're talking about is something to keep in mind. And to illustrate this, let's look at trees. Trees are a perfect example. I won't have you click on the screen here where the right-of-way is, but if you look at trees, okay, some people would think the right-of-way is the edge of the pavement, because that's all that's been maintained. Some would say it's down to the fence line. But the truth be told, that tree can define the right-of-way. Because if the tree is big enough to become a safety hazard, you probably can't say you've really maintained it. So the right-of-way in this particular case may actually be defined by the front of that tree, even on a road by use. Even at one time, if the trees had all been removed, the trees grow back up, you can lose that right-of-way, okay? Again, you shouldn't have a public facility on private property without a piece of paper, okay? Okay, so when we think about these issues, think about that foundation, that Constitution and the law, regulations that match that law, policies that you've set, and things like that, okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about powers and duties. And of course, I don't know if you've seen the new Spider-Man movie. I need to get out and see it. I'm assuming Adam Powell, who's helping in the background here, has probably seen it already. But if not, I know his son is probably making sure he sees it soon. But they would like to keep saying, he says it's amazing, with great power comes great responsibility. And you surprisingly, as a highway official, even if you're in a crew out in the roadway, you've got some pretty cool powers. But there is some responsibility, some duties that go with those particular powers. Okay, so when we look at that list we had before of responsibilities of a highway and public works department, there's a legal basis behind all of these things. And so safety is a major responsibility, of course. There's some things you can do because of that, but you have to do that within the foundation of the law, okay? Somebody whose trees could be considered a public use by providing shade for pedestrians in a healthy environment. Well, if the courts had ruled that way, they haven't. Because remember, in a high-speed roadway, a tree is considered a safety issue, and that trumps a lot of things. Usually, in fact, if there's anything the courts tend to focus on, if you do something with safety in mind, you're probably better off in a lot of ways. Though, yes, I understand trees have some value. And it's an interesting balancing act that we have to deal with. But there's always a legal basis for those powers and those duties. So let's talk about one that I know everybody loves to do, reports. So in your poll everywhere, list me a few required reports. We won't get into a lot of details in our hour together here, but give me some required reports that we got to deal with, okay? Give me some detailed reports. You're going to have a spending report, inspections, yeah, of bridges and things like that. Your 284 agreement, and we will come back to the 284 agreement for those who don't know what that is, okay? What other reports do you have? Equipment, yes, there's actually a requirement for a machine and equipment inventory that's actually in the law, this actually right in the law itself. A daily diary, that's not legally required, but boy, from a liability standpoint, I'd put it in the liability required reports area. A daily diary helps your agency as much as any other thing, yeah. Any permits or inspection reports that you've got on a job, yeah, these are all required reports, and they may be all the way up towards the agreement end. They may be written directly in the law. So there's all kinds of required reports out there. If you've got a stormwater system, you may have to have that. You probably need to have something, your local roads inventory. If you want CHIPS money, you have to send that into the state. That's in law, and then a regulation that goes with it, okay? What's your budget status? As a department head, if you're a DPW commissioner or highway superintendent, you're gonna have to have a budget status. Okay, you're going to have to do your payroll and your vouchers. You may have to have a plan of work. Okay, any accident reports. And remember, there's always a foundational legal issue behind it. Okay, and if you're an inspector, you got to have particular rules that come in. Those are the guides and policies that have been set up. Okay, so we think about these paperwork activities. There's usually something behind them. So let's talk about the most common one, and that's the 284 agreement for the towns. Now, that is an agreement between the highway superintendent and the board on general repairs and permanent improvements that are going to be done. That report should be signed, that agreement should be signed the very first meeting. If you've already had your organizational meeting, you should have a 284 agreement. And the reason for that is that legal basis, again, that foundational document. The responsibility of the highway agency is to do operational and maintain and build things. The responsibility of the board is fiduciary. They've got to deal with financial issues. And you need an agreement so everybody's on board to make sure we're on the same page. Now, a lot of people go, but what, I don't know exactly what we're going to do. What's this winter going to be like? It's already been relatively warm. Maybe we're going to have more potholes. The 284 agreement is just that. It's an agreement at the top of the pyramid. It can be changed every single month. It's not fixed in stone, okay? So you can put some general things in there now and then make modifications as needed. Good rule of thumb is the general repairs, you just list the amount of money and it's sort of a general list, and maybe you ask for a list of things that are being done later on. The permanent repairs, capital work, you list out more detail, and those can be modified as needed with an agreement, because you've got to remember, legally, you got to have money backing it up. And what happened if you get more money, like in CHIPS last year? There has to be an agreement to spend those funds. There actually has to be board action. So the idea of an agreement is really good. It's legally required in the law for towns, but it's really a good idea for every agency, okay? So let's just ask, does your department have an agreement with the board? Yes, a signed agreement, an example like the 284 agreement. Yes, but you just submit it to the board and they just review it. An informal one, maybe you do at your monthly meeting with your committee. No, you don't have an agreement, or you're not sure. Okay. Let's see what we get here. Okay, so most of you are not sure. Okay, about half. And in some respects, that's probably the answer we don't want the most. I'd almost rather say I don't have an agreement. At least I know where I stand. If you're not sure, that can get you in trouble. Okay. So you really want to make sure you have an agreement, okay? Now, again, there's no legal requirement for counties, villages, and cities, but it's still a good idea. At least you should be submitting something to the board, okay? So they can review it. And if they have any questions, they can get back to you, Okay, so go find that out. And if they won't sign the agreement, we've had towns that does happen, submit it anyway. Submit the form, at least you have done your duty as a highway official, okay? And then one more thing on the powers and duties that comes up, I know we hear about it a lot of times, something called FOIL, not aluminum foil or lead foil, but FOIL, which stands for Freedom of Information Law. You may sometimes see this abbreviated FOIA because it's agreement, but FOIL runs off the tongue a little bit better. The idea behind that is everything we do in the public sector is publicly available. Okay, now that doesn't mean meetings with an attorney. It doesn't mean personnel records. Those are not, quote unquote, public documents. They're not foilable. And there's court cases, case law that define that. And of course, regulations get written around those cases to define what's foilable, how quickly it has to be done. Again, all comes back to that foundational document. Okay. And one of the biggest duties, by the way, that most agencies have is emergencies. Okay. And then who can close the roadway? It may or may not be the highway official, depending on the issue. If it's under construction, it certainly is. But what happens in a flooding event? Well, there's a process. And if you don't know the process, you need to make sure you understand it. The highway official actually can only do certain closures. You may have to bring in the police agency or the state troopers or your town supervisor or the mayor to do the official closure. Okay, so for instance, travels advisories that we might see on Thursday with 7 inches of snow coming, that would actually be done at usually the county or state level. Okay, so these are all powers and duties that that foundational document comes into. Okay, and then somebody here says, is there a section of New York state law that describes what towns legally can do in terms of sidewalk construction? There is some stuff in there. You can create a specific special district. Okay. But the key is it's going to come out of the general fund. And we're going to talk about general fund issues here in just a bit. So I'm going to leave that question open so I don't forget to come back to it. So we'll talk about that. I do want to talk a little bit about liability and risk, however, because this drives a lot of what we do. But truth be told, if you put safety first, you're probably okay. You know, don't let a nice looking mailbox like this in the right of way. That's really not a good idea because that's a safety hazard. Okay, so what are some ways you could reduce liability for your agency? What are some ways you could do that? Okay, you can have an agreement. Yeah, make sure you've got good agreement. Make sure you've planned things out. Yep, being proactive is really important. Okay, put things in writing. Set up good policies. Yeah, good policies help you. Don't just hold to the policy exactly, though. Make sure you modify it. Remove your obstructions. Document things. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Communicate. The key here is having good records. That's why I'm a huge fan of a daily log. Okay. Because if something does happen, the lawsuit may take years to come out. Can anybody tell me what you actually had for lunch 3 years ago? Okay. What was the weather like? So good documentation. And by the way, one of the most important things when you document the good things. You know, don't just document the bad. Okay. Perfect example. Somebody says they had chicken. I hope that's in your law, but safety usually comes first. If you put safety first, you're going to be in pretty good shape. Now, in this particular case, the town was given permission to cut the tree down. They're not done. You've got to cut it right to the ground. If you've got permission to remove the tree, okay, now you've got a responsibility, powers and duties, to remove it so it's no longer a safety hazard. So remove it flush. Anything above a few inches can be a safety issue. So keep safety first and you're going to be in better shape. Document, document, document. And in terms of documents, one of the things we deal with is something called notice. Notice essentially keeps the local and state agencies from getting sued because of something that they weren't aware of. You know, we're going to get a nice warm up today. It's going to go from in the teens up into the 40s. It's very possible we may get some potholes. If somebody hits a pothole at 5 o'clock this evening, you may or may not be liable but them hitting the potholes if it wasn't reasonable for you to have known about it. And so this thing called notice. You have to be put on notice that there's an issue, and it comes in two flavors. There's written notice. Written notice means somebody has done something in writing to you. They sent you a letter. That counts. Emails. Court cases are starting to say, yeah, emails count as written notice, though there's still some case law on that to deal with. If somebody calls up on the phone and you talk to somebody, does that count as written notice? Raise your hand if you think it does count as written notice, just a phone call. Raise your hand. Use the hand raise. Got a few folks raising your hand. Okay. The answer is not sure. Again, there's case law with that. However, if you take the phone call, write down what someone's concerns are, that does become written notice. And there are agencies who think, oh, well, we'll reduce liability, we won't write it down. Turns out it's actually the exact opposite. Writing those complaints down, writing those service concerns down actually reduces the liability. Because yeah, it puts you on written notice, but it also shows you have a proactive policy to fix problems. And that alone can help you in court. Okay, there's actually good court cases about that. So when you get those calls, write them down. Okay, and there's procedures and policies and all that. And who can get written protection? Towns, the board has to pass a local law to get the state's legal written protections. Counties, it's very limited. Okay, and even then they have to pass a law to make it happen. Villages, interestingly enough, you're with a village, you've got written notice protection by state law. You don't have to do anything. And in the city, it depends on your charter. One other way, by the way, you can get written notice. This is an interesting one. If you get a phone call or a radio call from a state trooper, county sheriff, local police, that actually is considered written notice. So if you get a call from the police agencies, you need to take action. Write it down. Don't just take the radio call. The other type of notice is called constructive notice. And what essentially that says is if it's obvious, if it's been there for a year and you haven't done something, you should have known about it. Okay? If you got a pothole in front of your garage and it's been there for 2 months, you can't say, well, we were never given notice. It's pretty obvious. And there are court cases on this, case law, that say that. And of course, if you built it, it's constructive notice. You know, if you put in essentially a 1-inch gap for what should be flush for ADA ramps, you're not going to be able to say, oh, I didn't know about it. So if you built it yourself, that's notice, to keep that in mind. Okay. And then, of course, some financial concerns. We had someone ask earlier about financial stuff. Let's talk about that a little bit. Again, we had a whole session on budgeting back in the fall. You can go back and watch the recording. And we will be doing some of these again as we do these live webinars. And we have a whole workshop on budgeting. But the idea behind budgeting is there's a financial responsibility that we all have to be good stewards of public funds. And there's legal reasons behind all of that. And so there's account funds that we deal with. There's ledger code and object codes, and we're not going to get into those today, but I do want to talk a little bit about accounts. And this is a pretty important legal foundational activity of why we do this. The main account for most local governments is their general fund, okay? Now you may have a part general fund for towns, that would be a B account, but most of them are A account funds, general funds, okay? For highway agencies at the town and county level, there's specific highway funds. For highway, there's DA and DB. Highway activities that are the entire town, highway activities that are the town outside of the villages, okay? And the reason for that is that if you're in a village, you're not getting the same level of town highway work. You shouldn't be paying for things that are outside the village. So things like bridges are considered townwide because bridges are everywhere, and even within a village, it's a town bridge for capital work. So bridges would be a DA charge. But something like brush clearing, that would be a part town or DB charging. It's really just a matter of communication to the public, if you think about it. For counties, you'll have a D highway account and a DM machinery account. These are special funds. And the key to remember from a legal standpoint is funds can flow from the general to the town highway or the county highway, but they can't go the other direction. Once they've been allocated to those funds, those are special funds. They have to stay in those special funds. Okay. And there's rules behind that. There's policies, guidance, regulations, all based on the law, so that we spend the money in a wise manner. Okay, but you can't spend money you don't have. It has to be in the budget. Okay. And then there's tons of different accounts, but one that a lot of agencies do use, and I recommend it for any capital project, set up a specific fund. H is the letter that's designated for capital projects, to keep those funds separate so they don't get intermingled or lost. Okay. And it's good communication. Now, someone had asked about a sidewalk fund. Well, you can set up a sidewalk account. Okay. It's usually a general charge, by the way, especially for villages and cities. It's almost always going to be a general charge. But you can set up a specific fund for that, or you could include it as part of just a general account. When you're trying to decide which account to use, think about who has the actual control to set policy. Whoever has the actual control to do a particular thing, that's the account it belongs in. So if it's the highway responsibility, it's a D account for the towns and counties. But signs, traffic signs in the town and county level, it varies. For a town, it's actually the town board who has responsibilities under the vehicle and traffic law. So since the town board has the legal authority and actually has to pass resolutions or in some cases laws, that actually is a general fund charge. So your traffic signs, as an example, come out of the general fund. On the other hand, the work zone signs come out of the highway fund because work zones are being done by the town superintendent. Counties, on the other hand, the county highway superintendent has the authority to set up the signage. It falls under county D account. Okay, so these are all things to keep in mind. And in terms of a sidewalk account, yeah, there are ways to do that. And we can work with you if you're interested. Give us a holler. We can talk about that later on offline. Now, you should all have a purchasing policy. This is pretty important. Every agency is supposed to have a purchasing policy. It includes everything from when you can direct purchase, just go buy something, under $25, you can just go buy something, write it down and document it in a log. Things where you have to get oral quotes. Now, oral quotes can be done over the phone, but you still, again, document the oral quotes. Okay. When you have to get written quotes. Okay. And when you have to go to bid. And there are, of course, exceptions. We'll come back to some of the exceptions here in a little bit. But the key is every agency should set a policy. Okay. Now, there are state limits for bids that have to be followed. Okay. And so, for instance, in competitive bidding, general municipal law specifically says if you're doing public works, that means doing a chip seal or hiring a contractor to replace a bridge. If it's above $35,000, you have to go to competitive bidding or some form of competitive activity. Low bid, best value, something like that. If you're purchasing something above $20,000, you're buying a new truck, you're buying a pickup. If it's above 20, you have to go to bid system. Below those numbers, okay, you might be able to use written quotes, oral quotes, or direct purchases, depending on the amount. And that's a policy that should be set by the local board. In terms of what numbers people use, I see numbers all over the map. Good rule I like to see, I think written quotes, probably about half the price of the bids. Okay, so $10,000 for equipment for written quotes. So I've seen $5,000, that's not unreasonable. Okay, oral quotes, well, you have to at least get 3 or 4 people to talk to them, maybe half that. And then direct purchase is some amount that makes sense. But again, there may be a policy on how you log that, who has to approve it, and things like that. So just keep in mind policies, okay, that have to be done. So what I want to do is I want to spend our last 13 minutes or so together, putting it all together. You actually probably know more than you think, but let's put this together. And what we're going to do is we're going to ask some questions and show you how this all fits within this framework of why we do things from the Constitution to our agreements. Now, before I get into it too far, I do want to talk about standards and policies. And one of the most important standards and policies is standards and policies that you haven't adopted for geometric design, building the thickness of the roadway, safety, those kind of things. You really should have a written standard. We have one available on our website if you'd like to as a starting point. It's not going to get you everything, but it gets us a good starting point. And we'll be putting our website up here at the end. But Let me just ask, do you have a written standard for your roads and streets? Okay. Yes, you use the state standards. No, not sure, and none of the above. If you put none of the above, throw in the Q&A what that means. Okay. So good. Oh, well, that's really good to see. I'm happy to see that. Okay. Well over 50% of you have written standards for your roads and streets. That's good. Okay. And 25% of you use state standards. Obviously, some of you came from the state. If you did, I hope you're using state standards. Okay. The real key here is if you're using standards, are they ones that are reasonable for your agency? You know, state standards are really good for state, and a lot of counties probably should be using them. But if you got a really low volume road, the state standards might be overkill. But the key is having a set of standards. And I'm glad to see, you know, 80% of you have some standards. Okay. You really want to have that. And if you're not sure, go out and figure it out. Make sure you've got some standards. Okay. Now, in terms of, let's talk about another example of something, personal protective equipment. And I'm not going to talk about masks. And let's talk about one we all can agree upon, hard hats. Okay. Hard hats are really important. Here's an example. We got this picture sent to us. Here's a hard hat that did its job. A tree limb came down, hit the hard hat. The hard hat broke the way it's supposed to, and the worker was uninjured. Okay. So hard hats do the job, but you may or may not wear them 100% of the time. But the key is you probably should have a policy of when you wear the hard hat. You don't want to be like these, I hate to say it, 3 engineers on a rock slide out west where they didn't put their hard hats on, even though that was the policy for their agency. Now they were probably thinking, well, those big rocks will kill me. Well, the big problem wasn't the big rocks. There was small rocks continuing to rain down. And if a small rock, even an inch in diameter, drops 200 feet, it could at least give you a concussion, if not do something more serious. So you should have a policy. So let me ask, who sets a hard hat policy? And you can select more than one. You should be able to actually select as many, all 5 of them if you want. Who sets the policy? Okay, who sets the hard hat policy? Okay, so now here's an interesting thing, and this is actually just comes back to even legally, the law itself. Everyone actually does have some rights to set policies. So a crew leader could say, I want everybody wearing those hard hats anytime we've got the backhoe running, if you don't have a policy set by somebody higher up. So a crew leader has some rights to set some policies. But obviously the highway or DPW official can say, no, our policy is we always wear them anytime you get out of the truck. The board has some rights as well, as long as they're not decreasing safety. Okay, so they could mandate, for instance, that hard hats have to be of a particular color, as long as it's not changing safety. If it's a safety related issue, the department head, in this case, the highway DPW official, does actually continue to have that right. And that creates some conflicts in some areas, but hard hats could be, the board could set some things. There may be some state laws and PESH issues. And yeah, there's some federal policies that actually may set that. If you're getting federal dollars and you're in the right of way, you're going to have a hard hat on if you're on a job that's getting federal dollars. Okay. So there are policies that come into play. And there are also policies on what is a legal hard hat. Okay. So keep that in mind. You should be thinking about this. So can a local board pass a law that supersedes a state or federal law? No. Yes with caveats. Yes if more restrictive. Yes in every case. Do the home rule. What do we think? Okay. So most of you say yes if more restrictive. And that's the most common thing people say. Okay. And as a lot of you have said no, it supersedes, and that's what creates, I purposely use the term supersedes. You see people write that all the time. It turns out C is probably the closest answer to the truth. There are some home rule issues that allow boards to pass local laws that supersede the state or federal law. Okay. But we like to use the term, well, if more restrictive, but the problem with that, the case laws have said, well, what is more restrictive? Okay. So for instance, if the board passes something that says the bid policy is lower, they can do that because you're not breaking the state law of the $20,000 and $35,000. But there are times when it goes in the other direction and there's a confusion about what would be considered more restrictive. Okay. So policy says you have to have a safety vest on in the right of way. The town board can set a policy, you have to wear the safety vest all the time, even on any property. Yeah, that would probably be okay. But if they said you always have to wear a certain type of safety vest, maybe not. So there are some caveats. We typically like to say more restrictive, but again, think about the why. Make sure you understand what is more restrictive. I just like to say yes with some caveats. It has to make sure it doesn't break down against any regulations or laws that are set up above that. And yes, there are some things you can do. So let's go back and look at a common one, and that's purchasing policy. I said we'll talk about exceptions. So what are some exceptions to competitive bidding? Okay. What are some exceptions to competitive bidding? An emergency. Yes, a public emergency, you can do that, okay? Needs to be declared, and there's processes for that, okay? You can use value in some cases. If you're getting federal dollars, you can't. You can't use value for the actual contracts. You have to use competitive bidding. But, yep, state bidding, I see somebody put in the Q&A, yeah, using state bid. Sole source. Yes, sole source, but you got to define sole source, and you probably have to have the local board approve it before you can use it. And there's rules for sole source, there's regulations. Piggybacking, where you can piggyback off another local contract where they've already done the competitive bidding. Yeah, if it's allowed, and did your town board authorize it? Okay, and then the amount of contract, again, set under both the state and local policy. Okay, I'm going to give you 3 or 4 that I bet you didn't get, just as an example. There's a lot of them out there. Okay, jurisdiction of the vendor, probably not, unless it's a Buy America issue where it has to be somebody from America. Jurisdiction, probably not. But let me give you 3 that are examples. Surplus and secondhand equipment is an example of one where you can buy some things through surplus, especially from other municipalities. There are some local law exceptions prior to 1953 that still exist on paper. Leases, if approved by the board, could be done. Somebody got professional services before I got to it. Okay. Real property purchases and leases. Those are the most common exceptions. And the quality of the production material should be in your bidding system. Okay. So you can make sure that if somebody doesn't meet the bid, they're okay. You're still good. Okay. Don't have to remember these things. They're in those resources that we provided to you, but just keep that in mind. Because when it comes to these things, we're working together. We're going to be sharing stuff together. There's always a legal basis for doing that. Okay, so keep that in mind as we're moving forward. Okay, so one last one. Where's the edge of the right of way? Okay, let's try this one more time. Where's the edge of the right of way? People have put the utility pole, people put the edge of that sidewalk. There's a little fence there. Okay, this happens to be in a village, by the way, if you're wondering. Some said the edge of the sidewalk that's actually closer to the road because there's actually 2 sidewalks in the picture. Yeah, it's a street by prescription. Okay, the utility pole is probably there at the agreement with the village, so it would not define the right of way. It may even be a village utility, but you need to know that for sure. If it was placed without permission of the agency, it might be in front of the utility pole. If it was placed with their permission, it probably is where that fence is, if it's been maintained and has public use. Okay, again, good, something to think about. But now what happens if you've got a sight distance problem and your right of way is really narrow? It's a road by use. What are your options? What could you do here? Okay, I mean, what are the options in that case where it's a really tight corner? You could prune it, you could get an easement. Yeah, you could have an easement. Okay, you could do some clearing and trimming. There are some safety rules to allow you to do that. But again, you probably want to have some policies in place. You may need to do some signalization or signage to change traffic control to make it safe. Okay. You could do an engineering study to figure that thing out. You could trim the brush back with the property owner's agreement. Yeah, an agreement's the best thing if you can do it. Okay, you could do a taking. You could go to eminent domain and actually get the land if it's really a safety issue. Now, one that nobody's put in here, but again, there are legal things you could do. The town board can set a policy. The town board could set a policy that all land within a particular triangle, site triangle, has to be maintained as long as it's consistent for the entire town and it moves into the future. So that if somebody does something, they can't plant. They can't let things go into those spaces. Now, it takes time to get those to work, but that's something that could be done working with the town board or the village board to do these things. So there are options, but think about the why we do these things. You know, dangerous mailboxes, they're all over the place. They're pretty, they're nice, but boy, I wouldn't want to hit that with a car. So what are your options to deal with the dangerous mailbox? Any thoughts? What are your options to deal with the dangerous mailbox? You could do a local law if you needed to. You may not have to go that far. You could set a local policy. Yeah. And that could be just as a highway official. But it'd be nice if the board's involved with it too. Okay. Certainly request it, put it in writing that it needs to be removed. Okay. Put the people on notice that you've noticed. You know, maybe not, but you know, what is your policy if it does get hit? Okay. If you hit it with the plow, what is your policy? Because if you just hit it purposely, you probably would still have to replace it. If it's an accidental hit, that's where that comptroller's opinion comes into place. Talk to the landowner. We got some videos we could show you on what happens when a bad mailbox gets hit. Maybe that could help you out. But yeah, set a policy and enforcement be consistent. I know that a lot of agencies actually have the policy. They don't replace mailboxes. They just provide somebody with essentially a set of, here are the standards, and here's some cash for our hitting your mailbox. Okay, and you could use a 319 notice. That's a section of law that allows you to remove things. Okay, but the point is there are options that are available, but you need to think about that and set up a policy. Okay, so let's see if I can do this here right. Yep. Okay. So that's our webinar for today. We have more webinars coming up. Today was the roads and streets issue. These are the ones listed for the next 4 webinars, again, with a break being taken. There are more. We're going to be doing these webinars through the end of, well, middle of March before we start our in-person workshops. Okay, so please sign up. Again, if you have any questions or thoughts on any of these things, we'd be glad to hear them. Everything I've talked about is available. You can download the links. You can also go to our websites. Just search for CLRP, search for NYSLTAP. You can go to nysltap.clrp.cornell.edu, or you can even send me an email at davidorr@cornell. Okay. With that, I'll stay on for just a minute or so. If you have any questions, you can go in the Q&A. Hopefully this was useful for you, and we hope to see you next week. And for those of you who are new, welcome aboard, and thanks very much for joining us today. Any examples of the most common litigation? Ooh, that's a great question. The most common thing cited in a lot of cases is signage, because people think signage is something they can win on. In terms of litigation, usually it's a notice issues where they haven't followed up with notice. That's a real common problem, where they've been put on notice and they didn't do anything to resolve it. So notice is a big issue. And of course, right-of-way becomes a big issue on the roads by use and streets by prescription. Okay. With that, Adam and Amanda, I think we're open and no more open questions. So I think we can call it a great day, and everybody get out and enjoy this afternoon. It's going to be in the 40s, at least here in Ithaca. Take care, everybody.